Well, Chad, welcome to our expert series webinar. It's a big deal, very big
Yeah.
deal. So just quick introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, so my name is John Scott, CEO and one of the founders of a company called ScopeStack. So it came from my time working at an IT services organization and just being so fed up with using spreadsheets and Word templates to scope and price projects and all in pre-sales capacity. So that's what I've been doing for the past 4 years. And I met Chad in that journey. And so Chad, you want to give a quick who you are and a little bit of background?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it. It's fantastic to still be developing content, even in my new endeavors. But it's been a fun ride. Most people know me for my time at Enterprise Networking Solutions. We recently transacted a sale there in August, where by which we were bought by a larger holding company who is going to build a bigger VAR professional services type organization. And there's a good group of folks who have done this a couple of times already before at a global level. So it was an honor to even be approached and considered as one of the potential anchor companies for this new endeavor of theirs. So it's pretty exciting to see that progressing. They have a lot of experience. Obviously, my experience and background in professional services and sales at a high clip using leveraged procurement vehicles and things like that were a big reason for them wanting to acquire our former company. And my business partner all started the company 22 years ago and did a fantastic job of building an executive team that is second to none in my humble opinion. So
yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, there's nothing but respect for you and that business out there. So where we met originally, right, was at a CRN event. I was making a presentation to a boardroom that you were moderating, and it's always scary to go into those environments. You're like, oh crap, I hope this works, and I hope what I'm saying is meaningful. Well, I think, going into that was a thought, but like really once we started having that conversation with like 10 or 15 executives in the room, like, everyone's like, man, this is solving what I needed to solve, right? Or we're doing things the old fashioned way. So that's what I just wanted to get your input today, a pretty informal, conversation around like just the pre-sales process, what you've seen work, what you've seen not work, just common pitfalls that we could hopefully guide people and not going through, and just kind of go from there. Sound like a plan?
Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like a good plan. I like it. This is something that we can make our community better. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I know you're a huge advocate for that, but so let's just kind of walk through, what that looks like. And if I could,
there we go.
Oh yeah, there you are. There you're the expert today. A little bit of your background. So I know you gave some background in kind of the business and kind of the world you live in, but what specifically was your role at ENS, and kind of how were you, engaged in the pre-sales process?
Yeah, so I ran everything related to our pre-sales process, right? I was our executive vice president of sales and business development. I carried that role from the time I was, the 9th employee when we were $1 million in revenue, all the way to the end when we were close to 100 million in revenue. So awesome. It was a fantastic ride. My background as an engineer and a project manager really facilitated our ability to continue to grow our professional services organizations. That's what the former company started as, was just that. They just did projects, IT projects specifically. And we morphed into, we were having conversations, over a decade ago. My business partner and I were going, why are we doing all these architecture designs and then handing them over to a manufacturer to go sell all the product? Why can't we sell the product and do the services? Yeah. And so the company morphed a bit, and that was pretty exciting.
It's so funny because typically people start with product, right?
Yep.
And they try to build on services because they start to realize there's not much money in product. There's a lot more money in services. And so I think it's pretty cool that y'all started on the services side, right? I think that makes a very strong business,
It really did. It created a rigor too, in terms of our delivery always had to be top notch. It couldn't be haphazard, and it couldn't be, sort of fly by night. It needed to be very structured. It needed to be very diligent. we needed to do a good job. And we had sort of a mantra that we wanted to get, if we were going to sell products, we wanted to be very good at the professional services for those products. So
Right.
conversely, it turned into, we already had a very strong Microsoft practice, but then it turned into a very strong VMware practice. In addition to that, then it turned into a lot of infrastructure, networking, security started to come on, and it was sort of a layered approach, but we always wanted to make sure that our manufacturer relationships realized that it wasn't just us selling boxes. We also
Yeah.
wanted to deliver solutions. That was what we were all about. And I think, you know, it was interesting. We just had our golf tournament last week. It was our 10th annual. I started 10 years ago. And so it was our 10th annual. And I was talking to the woman that runs our professional services organization at the former company. And she goes, Chad, she goes, we have hired, just since the acquisition, we've hired so many more people because we're carrying on that mantra of just doing really good work. And they're adding people because the projects aren't slowing down. They're not getting, you know, any smaller. And that commitment to excellence in terms of doing it right is something that the new leadership is really letting her continue to cultivate. So it's super cool to see her doing that.
So note to self, we need to start a golf tournament. And then the next thing is, I think for us, like it's really interesting to see like services as the barometer for a healthy IT organization or IT reseller, VAR, MSP, whatever you want to call yourself. Like if you know, the ones that we saw through COVID and through all this stuff had a really strong just pre-sales services business, and they were able to weather the storm a lot more than those that were just completely focused on one vertical or one product or whatnot. So well, so in kind of your perspective, your old organization, they continue to grow. Like, can you kind of speak to the importance of, and you mentioned rigor a second ago, like speak to the importance of having a process both from like sales to pre-sales and post-sales, and kind of like what needs to happen to make sure that that's successful from beginning to end?
Yeah, I'll start by saying it's not something that happens overnight, and it was not something that was ever perfected. You know, because the reality is, you know, the rhythm of a sales organization versus the rhythm of a delivery organization tend to be a little bit different. And it takes a commitment and trust between those two organizations to really understand timing, communication, and a healthy respect for each other to make sure that, you know, that certain amount of rigor can be adhered to. It's not saying that you got to be, you know, rigorous unnecessarily or unnecessarily bureaucratic. It's just more of making a certain, you know, flow of information occur in a healthy way, so that it's not a throwing over the fence or a surprise, we got this PO, now we need you to go deliver it, right? Because unfortunately, as we grew, we saw pretty dramatic growth, you know, 5 to 7 years ago. And what was happening was that was starting to occur, right? The sales organization was going at a certain pace that was going at a different pace of the delivery organization. And so we needed to make sure that we were considerate of each other, right? Because you don't want to create, you know, an alienation factor where you're starting to, you know, have one organization or the other start skipping steps or not wanting to cultivate that. And so one thing that we did beyond the initial, even prior to the initial scoping, was we started to bring those two organizations together once a week, just to make sure that each of us knew what each of us was working on. Not at a micro detail, but just more broadly in terms of conversations that were being had, how projects were going. Because, you know, what would happen is sales organization would go off and do their thing, and they'd go get, you know, purchase orders from clients for whatever projects, and they would do it, you know, with a loose understanding of what the effort was or something like that. Then the delivery organization, they had the opposite problem. They were wrapping up projects, and, you know, the sales organization didn't know that they had people coming off projects. And so, you know, in the leadership chair, we would get frustrated because we'd go, wait, we don't want people on the bench. We need them to roll over to the next project. So that meant, you know, the two sides really needed to communicate to cultivate that we're putting everything in order, that the right people get the right things at the right time. So
did you see, was it sales, pre-sales, post-sales? I mean, that's how I typically think about it and talk about it, but was pre-sales part of the sales conversation? And like what did the process look like?
Yeah, so
Who's involved in it?
I was the sales organization for the first probably decade of ENS's real existence after I joined,
Yeah,
and that what that meant was being an engineer and a project manager. It meant I did a lot of my own scoping unless I didn't know something very specific about a particular technology or the timeline of it.
yeah,
So I was probably part of the I was probably the biggest part of the problem initially, right? As we grew and had more of a robust sales organization, we needed to make sure that the knowledge that I kind of had was able to be shared, and so I would turn into a bit of an overlay. But also, we needed to start bringing the subject matter experts into the pre-sales conversation to make sure that at least in that initial scoping that we're talking about here was
yeah,
sort of considered. Because sometimes customers were like, well, we don't need to get down to the level of detail yet. Right now, we just need sort of a broad brush stroke, right? Well, that requires some
dangerous.
communication, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, give me, and so what I would always tell my engineering organization is I would say, give me your real best effort and then pad it by 20 to 30%, because you gotta account for the what ifs, right, that might come between the time we're having this conversation and they go off looking for budget and the time
yeah,
that the actual RFP comes out where they're ready to respond, and we're having to compete against other entities and things like that, right? Because we did a lot of government, so we had to make sure that there's a certain time and place where you're allowed to communicate with the client and then you can't.
yeah,
And so there's only so much you could do from an initial scoping perspective in broad brushstrokes to provide input. So
yeah. So like what tools and process as it relates to like that initial scoping, LOE calculation, style development, like were y'all doing it the way that I used to do it prior to ScopeStack, which is spreadsheets, Word templates, or did y'all have a better process? Like what did that look like for you all?
I
And
hate
maybe
to
you can take it
say,
at like a high
unfortunately,
level.
yeah, unfortunately, for as advanced a tech company as we were and all the really amazing projects we did over the years, we were still doing it kind of the old school way, right? We'd use an Excel spreadsheet that had sort of regimented task lists based on overall project scope, and then you'd have the specific tasks that related to a particular technology or solution implementation, right? And so,
Yeah,
and you needed to do that because you needed to at least be able to balance numbers and move them around depending on who might do what, right? So, you start with scoping it as, hey, if we do all this work ourselves, this is what the level of effort is. If the customer
yeah,
is saying that they can take certain, tasks on, we have to remove those line items or reduce the amount of hours involved in them to account for it to get more of an accurate, scope, right? So, yeah, but it was Microsoft Word and Excel.
yeah. I mean, and again, that's the way I used to do it everywhere I worked, and you know, some of the most valuable resources in the organization are the ones typically responsible for this task. And so, as I was starting to manage a team, very similar to you, it was okay. Well, we have these guys and girls that we're paying a lot of money, um, you know, to be in front of clients, like talk about engagement, like that's where the value is for a pre-sales person, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Not copy pasting, doing spreadsheets and stuff like that, right? While it's a
Yep.
necessary step. So, I mean, were you able to reduce the load on those highly paid resources somehow, or did or was it like we just add more headcount to accommodate, the size and the scale that we're going after?
Yeah, the type of organization we had to really balance that conversation. We weren't big enough yet to really take on the overhead on a sales side of a dedicated sales engineer resource.
Yeah,
And so we made the conscious choice to choose subject matter experts that a certain percentage of their time in terms of effort that they spent for the company was involved in a pre-sales endeavor, right?
yeah,
Two things. One, it sharpened their skill set because it created more of a consultative approach, and made them more made their communication more meaningful in their everyday execution lives. But
hmm,
also in the pre-sales process, it let my sales organization be more considerate of the workload that they had, so that we're doing things at the right time and timing it in the right way. Not everything needs to be a fire, and it really shouldn't. If we are doing a good job as a sales organization, yes, there's going to be fires that come up, and yes, we're going to get phone calls from clients that say, I need this by tomorrow. But the reality is, if we're communicating right and we're going through the steps in the process, scheduling something a week or 2 weeks out to have a proper scoping conversation with the subject matter experts, letting them ask the very detailed questions that are necessary to understand really the scope of things that need to occur, then we're reaching sort of that happy medium. And we found that our organization could bear that overhead of those subject matter experts doing that. Now, the bigger the organization is going to get, they are definitely already making investments in sales engineering resources, because they want to make sure that they continue to grow both in our region and nationally, so that they can be more aggressive in terms of their acquisition. So, but we as an organization at the time just didn't have that wherewithal to bear. So we chose to pluck the SMEs in and not have that additional overhead of the SEs. But in good professional services organizations, even if you have that sales SE that's a part of the pre-sales process with that sales team, they need to be good stewards and intermediaries with the delivery organization, so that proper communication of not just timing, but scopes of work, proper LOE development is still paramount. They really need to still be plugged into that back end, quote unquote, back end organization, right?
Yeah. So like, just kind of thinking through like that initial scoping step, the way we think about it at ScopeStack is like the old school way of the legacy way, whatever you want to call it, of like spreadsheet and word template. Those things make perfect sense day one.
Yep.
Right. Day 2, day 3, day 4, those things start to deviate over time. And so what we thought is like, hey, well, what if we could couple together like level of effort with language, so that at the end of the day, I have both consistent pricing and how we price out services. It doesn't matter who's doing that work. It doesn't matter if Timmy or Jimmy or whatever is, scoping out that project. There's consistency in the language and the level of effort, at least from a starting point. Then you get to this like work breakdown, which is like, okay, here are all the like stripped down version of the services. It's not like we're handing off to the PMO a full-fledged statement of work. We're actually handing them both a statement of work and a work breakdown that shows hours, resource, the resource skill set that we use to price out the work. And so that's how we're ensuring alignment on the post-sales side.
Yeah.
Like if you could think of like a process, and maybe some of your coaching with other, partners, like you could craft like a perfect process from sales to pre-sales to post-sales, like a whole engagement, like what would that look like?
Yeah, for me, I had the unique timing in my career to not just be a project manager, but also to be an engineer, but also to become a project manager. And when I made that transition, it was kind of a big deal in my life, because at the time, as an engineer or architect working in projects, I would always say, I'm really sick of that project manager coming in and asking me, what's the status? What's the status? Where are we at with this? Where are we at with that? Yeah. And so, you'd give them percent completes, and you'd always say you were farther along than you were, because that would buy you some time and things of that nature. But when I became a project manager, I started to see it differently. I started to say, oh, wow. And then, coming into coming into a sales organization, I really started to then layer on the nuance of the importance of communication at all levels of this whole thing, right? So at the most rudimentary level, scope, schedule, budget are the three main things that everybody needs. Sales organization needs it because they've got to identify how much revenue is coming in, so that they, can forecast accurately in terms of, a company can forecast accurately of how many more people it can hire and all that fun stuff. A delivery organization needs the same information, because they need to make sure, do we have the skill set? Do we have the right people? Is the timing right? We've got to establish proper timing and everything else, because we may have a backlog of delivery, things of that nature. So at the most rudimentary level, that scope, schedule, budget is important. Beyond that, then, is the proper communication and timing of things, right? So I think it's absolutely, from the time that a sales op is identified, what we were trying to do as an organization is very quickly identify, is it even in our best interest to respond, right? Because as a company, when we were young, we would want to respond to everything, because you needed to respond to everything just to stay alive. You wanted to be able to say, yeah, I can do that, I can do that. But as you become a more mature organization, we really started having more of those, are we actually the best partner to do this? Should we even bother having the conversation? Yeah, it sucks because we lose out on an opportunity, but if it's not really in our core skill sets, maybe it's a better idea to just politely decline and tell the customer, thanks, but no thanks. We can't do this one, right? Or better yet, if it's not us, identify a partner who does have that skill set and hand it off, right? And then we're still a good steward in terms of, creating that connectivity, for the client. We came to you, you said you couldn't do it. You were very honest about it, but you found us the best next thing is another partner like you that's really good at execution. So, so that was the reputation that we developed. And I think that's imperative to really do is you've got to make sure you've got that scope, schedule, budget, you've got that understanding, and then the good communication across all layers between pre-sales, sales, and post-sales. So
I love it. Love it. All right. So this is controversial, right? So every project, was it different? So was every project you did a snowflake?
Every project was different. No. So I love this slide only because there are definitely two schools of thought. And when it comes to, and you're right, it can be very controversial. When it comes to quote unquote standard services, I always equated standard services to things like manufacturer delivered services, things like that are, right. They're SKUs, they're SKU-wise services that are boilerplate, that have a boilerplate SOW. And I use an example, we had a lot of hardware manufacturers, right? And you had an SOW that would be the rack and stack conversation, right? Pretty straightforward, 8 to 16 hours. You're going to do X, Y, Z. You're going to test X, Y, Z. And at the end of the 1 or 2 day engagement, that technology is going to be up and running in a rack and lights are blinking. Yeah. Then you have what a lot of folks affectionately call the professional services or custom services, where we have to be a little bit more considerate. However, the thing that I love about like ScopeStack, this doesn't mean that everything has to be custom. What it means is you still have a standard delivery capability, right? Or approach. And yes, and that's parts uniform. And that's what I love about ScopeStack is you guys would put that all into a templatized outline that makes delivery organizations say, okay, we're still going to follow our process. Granted, every project may have its nuance, but it doesn't mean that our delivery is different, right? Our delivery is still our delivery and how we do it and our methodology and our process. The only thing that's custom, quote unquote, may be the technology or the solution that's being implemented and the tasks that are associated with certain nuances of that. But you're still going to have a beginning, middle, and end. You're still going to have, a methodology and approach that is uniform, so that it's not reinventing the wheel every single time. Because if you do it that way, you're never going to get to a point where you can have really good P&L and understanding how profitable can we be as an organization in terms of our delivery of expected services, right?
Yeah. So
go ahead.
My thought process is like every project has a variation of a standard service.
Yes.
It's like a combination of these two things, right? So like the example you mentioned of SKUs, like a lot of, not just even manufacturers, but a lot of other service providers will try to build SKUs purely for speed, right? Like, here's the one offering, we think we can cover majority of what we do with this one offering, but it doesn't change. Like it's in PDF format, right? Like you can go get it, you can send that to the client, and there's one price for it. But like my experience with that is more times than not, it never fit.
Right.
So what if I had a standard framework, an approach, like you mentioned, of a service and how I deliver that service, but have the flexibility to modify it, have the flexibility to add services into the framework, into the approach of my service, so that we can do exactly what you're talking about.
Yep.
The alignment between, post sales and delivery becomes much cleaner. I can then start, closing that loop potentially, like, okay, well, we scoped it for 4 hours, we deliver it for 2 hours consistently. Yep. We need to update that back and make sure that now when we sell it, we're selling it at 2 hours, so we're more competitive.
Yep.
Right. And so I think there's just a whole, and it's like a very, we talk to people all the time. Everything we do is custom. Sorry. I don't know what to say at that point, but, right. So like, I think every service is a version of a standard service, or should be.
Absolutely. I tend to agree. Yeah. And that was actually, as our organization matured and got got bigger, we needed to be more effective in our delivery of LOEs. So we had to get to uniform, templatized sort of approaches with only deviation from maybe the particular task that existed, right? But there's still, you know, a standard, like you said, work breakdown structure that was sort of uniform in its ability, and it was agnostic to whatever technology or solution was being implemented. But you're still following a semi-uniform process, right? Unless it's pure staffing. If it's pure staffing, fine, it's pure staffing, right? You're placing a body, they're going to live there for 6 months to a year, whatever it's going to be, and they, you know, they punch a time card.
I mean, the only variable is time.
It's time, exactly. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But in that regard, then we're not talking about scope, schedule, budget, which are the three key aspects of any good project. So
yeah. So all right. So say we've scoped out a project, we're happy with it. Like the whole review process internally. So this is not client review. This is more or less, okay, how do we make sure the right people get eyes on this project consistently every time? Like, what did that process look like for you, either at ENS or in other places that you've kind of worked with?
Yeah, for most organizations, this back-end review tends to be a little bit tedious as well, because you'll have maybe, I wouldn't say too many cooks in the kitchen, but the reality is you'll have, if we have a standard, my thoughts on this is, if you have a standard approach that is pretty uniform and really only deviates again around specific technology tasks and or, you know, solution sets that are unique, then this process should be a lot more streamlined, and the reviewers should be the SME who provided any deviation or LOE change, and you know, the PMO leaders, right? I mean, that's really where it is. From a sales perspective, I always like the sales team to be involved because they need to be aware, but the back-end review tends to be, in most organizations, the longest part, because if the reviewers are also folks that are doing delivery, they're never given the opportunity to really, you know, focus on the review. And so, you know, a certain amount of maturity has to occur in an organization to facilitate that process to be cleaner. But again, that's where getting to sort of what a ScopeStack does is really helps this, because it lets possibly those reviewers still be the implementers or folks that are involved in implementation, but lets them review at a more efficient pace. And lets the sales organization as an individual contributor on terms of, hey, I know what the budget is, I know what the customer has the appetite for, let them at least still have, it doesn't mean that, because I think where a lot of sales folks go wrong in this process is they want speed. They just want to hurry up and get it back to their client. That's what their client said, and they don't want to look bad in front of their client. But the reality is we have to have a little bit of that rigor in place to make sure we don't have a oops, we forgot those two tasks, or a oops, we really didn't consider the P&L, and the resource that we would assign to this is a lot more expensive than we originally anticipated. And so that budget just is unrealistic, right? Somebody has to be responsible for that. And most organizations, it's sort of flat on the back end, and so it ends up being one or two people. In larger organizations where the P&L is more rigid and more sought after, you start adding layers of bureaucracy that exist in that process, and it just elongates it that way. And so you know, it's important to really find a way to streamline that. That's one of the things I love about what ScopeStack can do, because it can make that review process much quicker.
Yeah, I mean, the way we think about it is like, okay, well, I can get peer review done, then I can intelligently route technical QA right across practice areas, and then maybe get sales involved to, you know, give their opinion on it. And then the final step is business approval, where leadership is, right? And maybe certain levels of leadership are automatically notified based on the size of the project and things like that. So, you know, having that process, we feel like just brings, again, just another level of maturity to an IT services organization that sometimes is, to your point, very tedious, or it's manual, or there may not even be one, right? And so whatever we can do to bring that to bear. But no, man, this was solid, right? So I have the deal one close, you know, slide up here, like this is the end goal of all this, to make money. We won the deal. So, you know, I think, you know, we just wanted to, you know, kind of walk through this, get your experience around the whole process, Chad. I know you're joining us from Mexico or somewhere in the world today. So thank you for doing that and taking out some time.
Thank you.
Where can people contact you? I know you have a pretty strong LinkedIn
I
presence?
do.
If it's not LinkedIn, where can they get access to you?
I mean, I'm pretty easy to find. Our website is www.hsbs-inc.com, but LinkedIn is actually the best platform to reach me. I'm very easy to find. Chad Hodges. I've got, tons of connections there. So chances are somewhere in the ecosystem, they talk about 6 degrees of separation. I feel like in our industry, it's like 1 or 2 degrees, right?
Yeah, it is.
So it really is. I mean, even one of your investors, I didn't even realize, he was somebody that I knew from a past life. So it was fantastic to be able to, go through that. And I'm surprised every week by the connections that we have, and I love it. So I thrive on that. I love connecting people to people, even if it's not to do business with me. If you see something on LinkedIn that catches your eye that you think you want to know more about, that I have access to, or I know someone that does it, please don't hesitate to reach out. I love to network at all different levels. So
good stuff. Thanks, Chad. Yeah. So thank you for joining us on our expert series. If you've missed some of the other ones, or you want to, make sure you don't miss the next one that we'll have probably in December, scopestack.io/expert. So you can see our past events as well as any future upcoming events. So again, Chad, thanks for your time, sir. And hope you have a good one.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
All right, man. Bye.
All right. Cheers.